What transforms a privileged medical student into the world's most iconic revolutionary? The answer lies in a motorcycle journey that changed everything. This is the story of Ernesto Che Guevara, a man whose face adorns a million t-shirts, yet whose true story is far more complex, fascinating, and tragic than any myth. If you want more stories like this, stories of revolutionaries who dared to challenge empire, subscribe to the channel now, because history is deeper than the slogans on t-shirts. June 14th, 1928. Rosario, Argentina. Ernesto Guevara de la Serna was born into an aristocratic but unconventional family. His parents were intellectuals who valued ideas over wealth. But within weeks, baby Ernesto faced his first battle. A severe asthma attack nearly killed him at just 2 weeks old. The doctors were grim. His mother blamed herself for taking him swimming in cold water. From that moment on, asthma would be Ernesto's constant, invisible enemy, wheezing through every breath, fighting for air during Argentina's humid nights. Most parents would have coddled a chronically ill child. Not the Guevaras. They moved to the dry mountain air of Altagracia, hoping it would ease his breathing. But they also taught young Ernesto something crucial: never surrender to your limitations. If asthma tried to stop him from playing rugby, he'd play harder. If it made running difficult, he'd push through the pain until his lungs screamed. His childhood home became a sanctuary of ideas. While other wealthy Argentine families hosted dinner parties, the Guevaras hosted revolutionaries fleeing Franco's Spain. Young Ernesto grew up surrounded by passionate debates about injustice, fascism, and the Spanish Civil War. He didn't just read adventure books. He lived in a household where real adventures in human liberation were discussed over dinner. His mother, Celia, was fierce and independent. She taught him to question everything, to read voraciously, to think critically. By age 12, Ernesto was devouring Pablo Neruda's poetry, Jack London's adventures, and Karl Marx's theories with equal enthusiasm. Here's where Che Guevara defies every stereotype you might have. Academically, brilliant. The boy who could barely breathe somehow excelled in school, consuming books like oxygen. Philosophy, poetry, engineering, mathematics. Nothing was off-limits to his hungry mind. He taught himself French just to read Baudelaire in the original language. He played chess competitively. He was, by every measure, an intellectual powerhouse. But Ernesto wasn't just a reader. He was a writer. From his teenage years, he kept detailed journals and notebooks, documenting everything he saw, thought, and felt. He wrote poetry, philosophical reflections, and observations about the world around him. This habit of writing would become crucial. His diaries would eventually transform from personal musings into revolutionary documents that would inspire millions. And here's what makes it fascinating. He was also intensely physical. Despite chronic asthma that would hospitalize him repeatedly, Ernesto became obsessed with rugby. Imagine this: a young man who needs an inhaler just to walk upstairs, throwing himself into one of the world's most brutal contact sports. His teammates nicknamed him Fuser, a contraction of El Furibundo Serna, meaning the raging Serna, because he played with such ferocious intensity. He'd play through attacks, his face turning purple, wheezing on the sidelines, then charging back into the scrum. It was madness. It was also character forged in suffering. Swimming, cycling, mountain climbing, Ernesto conquered them all, turning his greatest weakness into his defining strength, an iron will. In 1948, he enrolled in the University of Buenos Aires to study medicine. Not because he wanted to be rich. The Guevara family fortune was already dwindling, but because he wanted to understand suffering, to fight it, to cure it. His fellow students remember him as disheveled, intense, always arguing. He'd show up to class in the same worn sweater, carrying books on subjects that had nothing to do with medicine. While others memorized anatomy, Ernesto debated dialectical materialism. But here's the thing, he was a brilliant medical student. He excelled in his studies, particularly in research. He could have become a renowned doctor, published papers, lived comfortably. Then came 1952. January 4th, 1952. A battered 1939 Norton 500 cubic centimeters motorcycle called La Poderosa, the Mighty One, sputtered to life in Buenos Aires. 23-year-old Ernesto Guevara and his friend Alberto Granado, a biochemist, had a plan: ride this ancient machine 8,000 kilometers across South America. See the continent. Have an adventure. Live a little before settling into professional careers. What they couldn't know was that this journey would change the course of history. The early days were pure adventure. Two young men, sleeping rough, charming their way into meals, repairing their constantly breaking motorcycle with wire and hope. They swam in Chilean lakes, danced in mountain villages, flirted with local girls, and felt gloriously alive. But then the motorcycle finally died in the Chilean desert. They continued on foot, by hitchhiking, on cargo boats, and as they slowed down, they started to truly see. In Chile's Chuquicamata copper mine, they met workers who labored in toxic conditions for pennies while American companies extracted billions in profit. Ernesto saw men his own age dying of silicosis, their lungs destroyed, discarded like the machinery they operated. In Peru, they worked at the San Pablo leper colony in the Amazon. This was supposed to be a medical opportunity, a chance to practice clinical skills. Instead, it became a revelation. The leper colony was divided by a river. On one side lived the doctors and nuns, the healthy, the privileged. On the other side, the patients, the sick, the outcasts, the forgotten. Every night, the medical staff would retreat across the river, maintaining a safe, sanitized distance from suffering. On Ernesto's 24th birthday, despite his asthma, despite the dangerous currents, he swam across that river. Not for medicine, not for research, but to celebrate with the patients as equals, to share in their humanity rather than study their disease from a comfortable distance. That swim was symbolic. Ernesto Guevara was crossing more than a river. He was crossing an ideological barrier. Throughout that journey, he kept detailed journals, writing every single day. His pen captured everything: the landscapes, the conversations, the injustices. He wrote poetry about the stars over the Andes. He documented medical cases at the leper colony. He analyzed economic systems exploiting workers. These weren't just travel notes. This was a writer witnessing the birth of his own revolutionary consciousness, and he was documenting every moment of the transformation. His writing transformed from the observations of a tourist to the analysis of a witness to injustice. He saw indigenous people displaced from their lands. He saw malnutrition, preventable diseases, and poverty so deep it seemed geological. But here's what radicalized him. He realized these weren't isolated problems. They were connected. The American company profiting from Chilean copper was linked to the poverty he saw everywhere. The systems that kept some people healthy and comfortable depended on keeping others sick and exploited. In his journal, he wrote something profound. I now know, by virtue of an interaction whose minimal beauty must be constantly defended, that I have ceased to be I and have become we. This wasn't just poetic language. Ernesto the individual, the brilliant student, the athlete, the privileged Argentine, was dying. Something else was being born. When he returned to Buenos Aires in September 1952, he finished his medical degree in record time, essentially cramming an entire final year into months of intense study. He graduated in April 1953. He was now Dr. Ernesto Guevara, but he would never practice conventional medicine again. Dr. Guevara left Argentina again almost immediately. This time, the journey was different. He wasn't a tourist anymore. He was searching for something, a way to heal societies, not just individuals. In Bolivia, he witnessed a revolution firsthand. The nationalist movement had just overthrown the old oligarchy and nationalized the tin mines. For the first time, Ernesto saw armed peasants who had taken power. It was messy, imperfect, but intoxicating. Then Guatemala. In 1954, Guatemala was attempting something radical under President Jacobo Arbenz. Land reform that would redistribute unused land from massive corporations like the United Fruit Company to landless peasants. It was democracy in action, a government trying to help its own people. Ernesto arrived in Guatemala City and threw himself into the political ferment. He was just an observer, a medical doctor offering his services, but he was learning, absorbing, connecting with other young Latin American radicals. It was here, among exiled Peruvians, Cubans, and other revolutionaries, that he earned his famous nickname. Argentines habitually punctuate their sentences with che, a casual interjection like hey or pal. His constant use of this verbal tick led everyone to call him simply Che. The name stuck. Ernesto was fading. Che was emerging. Then, June 1954, everything collapsed. The CIA, working with the United Fruit Company, orchestrated a coup. American planes bombed Guatemala City. A military dictator replaced the democratic government. Che watched, powerless and furious, as everything he'd hoped for was destroyed by American imperial intervention. He tried to organize resistance. He volunteered to fight. But the democratic government surrendered without a real battle, hoping to prevent bloodshed. Che was disgusted by what he saw as their weakness. He fled to Mexico, carrying two bitter lessons. First, American imperialism would crush any attempt at social justice in Latin America. Second, you cannot reform these systems democratically. They must be overthrown by force. In Mexico City, working odd jobs and studying Marxism intensely, Che Guevara was ready. Ready for what? He didn't yet know. Then, in 1955, he met a failed revolutionary with an impossible dream. His name was Fidel Castro. The meeting happened at a dinner party. Fidel Castro, recently released from a Cuban prison after a failed attack on the Moncada barracks, was in exile, planning another attempt to overthrow the Batista dictatorship in Cuba. They talked through the night. Fidel spoke for hours, as he always did, about Cuba, about justice, about revolution. Che listened, challenged, questioned. By dawn, Che had volunteered. He would join Fidel's next invasion as the expedition's doctor. Here's what makes this fascinating. A doctor and a lawyer were about to lead a revolution. Che Guevara, trained in medicine, not military tactics. Fidel Castro, trained in law, not warfare. Neither had formal military training. Yet in Mexico, they threw themselves into guerrilla preparation with obsessive intensity. They trained in the mountains outside Mexico City. Physical conditioning, weapons handling, tactical maneuvers. The doctor who could barely breathe pushed himself harder than anyone. The lawyer studied military strategy like he once studied legal codes. Both excelled, not because of natural talent, but through sheer revolutionary will. And here's the remarkable thing. When they recruited fighters, many were former soldiers, men with actual military experience. But it was the doctor and the lawyer who became the commanders. Why? Because revolution isn't won by those who know how to follow orders. It's won by those who know why they're fighting. Young men, brilliant and passionate, soon found themselves taking orders from a wheezing Argentine doctor and a verbose Cuban lawyer. And they followed, because Che and Fidel had something professional soldiers often lack: absolute conviction and the intellectual capacity to inspire it in others. November 25, 1956. 82 men crammed onto a decrepit yacht called the Granma, literally falling apart, leaking, overloaded, and heading into rough seas toward Cuba. It was absurd. It was desperate. It should have been suicide. And it almost was. They landed in a swamp, off target and immediately ambushed by Batista's military. Of the 82 men, only about 20 survived the initial landing and escape into the Sierra Maestra Mountains. They were scattered, wounded, demoralized. Che faced a moment of choice. Stumbling through the jungle under fire, he dropped his medical supplies to pick up a box of ammunition. In that instant, the doctor became a soldier. In the Sierra Maestra, Che transformed from an intellectual revolutionary into a military commander. His asthma was brutal in the humid mountains, but he never complained. While other guerrillas rested, Che read military strategy, philosophy, poetry. He taught literacy classes to peasant fighters. He executed deserters and traitors without hesitation. But even in the midst of warfare, he wrote. His guerrilla diary documented battles, strategies, and the daily struggles of revolution. He wrote essays on guerrilla warfare that would become military textbooks. He penned articles for the rebel newspaper. The revolutionary was also a chronicler, ensuring that history would know exactly what happened in those mountains. Fidel recognized something in Che, an absolute commitment, a willingness to do whatever the revolution required. Che rose through the ranks to become commandante, leading his own column of guerrilla fighters. His column became legendary. They won seemingly impossible victories through discipline, strategy, and Che's tactical brilliance. He was ruthless with enemies, but established schools and hospitals in liberated territories. He paid peasants fairly for food and supplies, unlike Batista's army, which simply stole. The revolution was winning hearts and minds. December 1958. The decisive moment. Che's column was ordered to cut Cuba in half by capturing Santa Clara, a major city in the center of the island. With just 300 fighters against thousands of government troops, it should have been impossible. Che derailed an armored train carrying reinforcements and weapons. The battle for Santa Clara lasted 5 days of urban warfare. On December 31, 1958, the city fell. That same night, dictator Batista fled Cuba. On January 1, 1959, the revolution was victorious. Fidel Castro's ragtag guerrillas had overthrown a dictatorship backed by the United States, and the Argentine doctor with chronic asthma had been at the heart of it all. Che Guevara, at 30 years old, was now one of the most powerful men in Cuba. Cuba after the revolution was chaos, euphoric, terrifying chaos. Che didn't rest. He became president of the National Bank, signing currency simply Che. He led firing squads executing Batista's officials. He negotiated with the Soviets for support as America turned hostile. But it was December 11, 1964, at the United Nations General Assembly, where Che delivered his most powerful message to the world. Picture this: the UN headquarters in New York, diplomats in expensive suits, the polished language of international diplomacy. And then Che Guevara walks in, beard unkempt, olive-green uniform, speaking not as a diplomat but as an accuser. He didn't come to negotiate. He came to condemn. For over an hour, Che's impassioned speech tore through the pretenses of the assembled nations. He attacked South Africa's apartheid brutally, demanding to know why the UN did nothing to stop it. Then he turned his fire on the United States itself. With shocking directness, he confronted America's treatment of black citizens. Those who kill their own children and discriminate daily against them because of the color of their skin. Those who let the murderers of blacks remain free, protecting them, and furthermore punishing the black population because they demand their legitimate rights as free men. How can those who do this consider themselves guardians of freedom? The speech was relentless. He spoke of the Congo, where he accused Western powers of murdering Patrice Lumumba. He condemned the U.S. economic blockade of Cuba. He called for global revolution, declaring solidarity with Vietnam, with all of Latin America, with every colonized and oppressed people on earth. The American delegation sat stone-faced, furious. Other nations were electrified. And then Che ended with two words that would echo through history, the battle cry of the Cuban Revolution. Patria o muerte, homeland or death. The hall erupted in applause from the delegations who saw him as a hero. He wasn't just a revolutionary anymore. He was a global symbol of resistance against empire. But symbols can become trapped, and Che Guevara was starting to feel like a caged lion. By 1965, Che was restless in Cuba. He'd helped build the revolution, but now came bureaucracy, committees, compromises. Fidel needed him, but Che couldn't sit still while revolutions were calling across the Third World. Patrice Lumumba, the democratically elected leader of the newly independent Congo, had been assassinated with CIA involvement in 1961. The Congo was descending into civil war, and various factions were fighting for control. Che saw an opportunity. If a successful revolution could be sparked in the heart of Africa, it could ignite the entire continent. In April 1965, Che secretly left Cuba with a small group of Cuban fighters to support Laurent Kabila's rebel movement in the Congo. It was a disaster from the start. The Congolese rebels weren't the disciplined guerrillas of the Sierra Maestra. Many were more interested in loot than liberation. They believed in dawa, a magical protection that would make enemy bullets turn to water. They refused Che's military discipline and training. Che's asthma was severe in the jungle humidity. Malaria and dysentery ravaged his men. The local population didn't trust these foreign revolutionaries. The CIA and Belgian mercenaries were well equipped and effective. For 7 months, Che fought in the Congo, trying to create a revolution through sheer will. But you cannot export revolution like coffee. The conditions that made Cuba's revolution succeed, popular support, a hated dictator, geographic advantages, didn't exist in the Congo. In November 1965, defeated and ill, Che withdrew from the Congo. It was the only battle he ever lost, and it haunted him, and true to form, he wrote about it. His Congo diary is perhaps his most honest work, unflinching in its analysis of what went wrong, refusing to romanticize failure. He wrote, "This is the story of a failure. Not many revolutionaries have the courage to document their defeats with such brutal honesty. But Che Guevara didn't know how to accept failure. He knew only one response: try again." Che couldn't return to Cuba. Not yet. Not in defeat. He was too proud, too committed to the global revolution. So he chose Bolivia. His reasoning was strategic. Bolivia was the heart of South America, bordering 5 countries. A successful guerrilla movement there could spread revolution across the entire continent, creating many Vietnams that would overwhelm American imperialism. November 1966. Che arrived in Bolivia in disguise, nearly unrecognizable with his beard shaved and hair thinned. He established a guerrilla base in the remote Nankawaza region with about 50 fighters, Cubans and Bolivians. Everything that could go wrong went wrong. The Bolivian Communist Party, which should have been their ally, betrayed them, seeing Che as a competitor for power. The peasants Che expected to support them were suspicious of these foreign guerrillas, who didn't even speak their indigenous languages. The terrain was brutal. Desert canyons, nothing like Cuba's mountains or Congo's jungles. Che's asthma was worse than ever. His medication ran out. He could barely breathe in the high altitude. The CIA, learning from Cuba, had trained the Bolivian military in counterinsurgency. They were effective, cutting off the guerrillas from supplies and support. Che's group splintered. They spent months wandering, lost, starving, picking off scattered military patrols but achieving nothing strategic. Yet even as everything collapsed around him, Che wrote, every single day. His Bolivian diary entries chronicled the desperation, the hunger, the disease, the isolation. Each entry grew shorter as conditions worsened, but he never stopped documenting. The writer in him compelled him to record it all, even knowing these might be his final words to history. October 8, 1967. Che's column, reduced to just 17 men, was surrounded in a ravine near the village of La Higuera. A firefight erupted. Che's rifle was destroyed by a bullet. He was shot in the leg and captured, still alive. The Bolivian soldiers didn't even know who they'd caught until they saw his hands, still bearing the scar from a childhood accident. It was Che Guevara. They took him to a small, dilapidated schoolhouse in La Higuera. The building was falling apart, crumbling adobe walls, dirt floor, a cracked chalkboard. Che sat on the ground, hands tied, leg bleeding, waiting. The morning of October 9th, he made one final request. He asked to see the village schoolteacher, a young woman named Julia Cortez, only 22 years old. She brought him a bowl of peanut soup. When she entered, terrified, unable to look him in the eyes, Che looked up at her with that piercing gaze that had intimidated diplomats and inspired revolutionaries. And then he did something extraordinary. Even in his final hours, wounded and awaiting execution, the revolutionary became a teacher one last time. He pointed around the crumbling schoolhouse, the broken walls, the inadequate supplies, the poverty of it all. "This is why we're fighting," he told her. "For you. For people like you." He explained how government officials drove Mercedes cars while teachers like her worked in buildings that were falling apart, while children had no books, no future. This inequality, this injustice, this is what the revolution was about. Julia Cortez would later say his gaze was unbearable, piercing, and so tranquil. She couldn't forget it. Hours later, the order came from the Bolivian government. The Bolivian government, under orders from the CIA, made a decision. Che would be executed. They couldn't risk a trial, couldn't risk him becoming a martyr through a public process. A Bolivian sergeant named Mario Terán was ordered to shoot him. Terán hesitated. Even he was afraid of killing such a legendary figure. Che's reported last words vary in different accounts, but he essentially told his executioner, "Shoot, you are only going to kill a man. Multiple shots. Aim to look like battle wounds." At 1:10 p.m., Ernesto Che Guevara was dead at age 39. The Bolivian military displayed his body like a trophy, photographing it to prove the revolutionary was dead. They cut off his hands for fingerprint identification. They buried him in a secret grave. They thought they'd killed the revolution. Instead, they'd created an eternal icon. And here's the most extraordinary irony of all. 40 years later, in 2007, Mario Terán, the man who pulled the trigger, was going blind from cataracts. He had retired into poverty, unable to afford the surgery that could save his sight. Then Cuba sent doctors to Bolivia as part of Operation Miracle, providing free medical care to the poor. Among those doctors' patients was Mario Terán. Cuban physicians, trained in the revolutionary system that Che helped build, inspired by the ideals he died for, restored the sight of the man who killed him. Free of charge, Cuba's state newspaper wrote, 4 decades after Mario Terán attempted to destroy a dream and an idea, Che returns to win yet another battle. Even Che's executioner benefited from Che's legacy. The revolution he tried to kill had saved his eyes. So who was Che Guevara? A doctor who abandoned medicine to heal societies through revolution. A privileged Argentine who dedicated his life to the world's dispossessed. A brilliant intellectual who chose the jungle over the university. A ruthless executioner who read poetry to guerrilla fighters. A writer who documented every step of his revolutionary journey, from the motorcycle diaries that awakened his consciousness, to the guerrilla warfare manuals that became textbooks of resistance, to the final desperate entries in Bolivia that read like a revolutionary's epitaph. A man who couldn't breathe easily, but refused to accept any limitation. He was contradictory, complex, controversial. What's undeniable is this: that asthmatic boy from Argentina who struggled for every breath lived more intensely, fought more ferociously, and dreamed more radically than most people would dare. He wrote his own epilogue in a letter to his children before leaving for Bolivia. Above all, always be capable of feeling deeply any injustice committed against anyone, anywhere in the world. This is the most beautiful quality in a revolutionary. 30 years after his death, his remains were finally found and returned to Cuba, where they rest in a mausoleum in Santa Clara, the city where he won his greatest victory. But his real legacy isn't in that tomb. It's in the millions of faces on T-shirts, posters, and murals worldwide. Whether you agree with his methods or not, Che Guevara remains what he always was, a symbol that another world is possible, and that some people will give everything to try to create it. The question he leaves us with is simple and impossible. What are you willing to fight for? And if you want more stories like this, stories of revolutionaries who dared to challenge empire, subscribe to the channel now, because history is deeper than the slogans on T-shirts. Organize, resist, be unbreakable.